Why did you cross the center line back there?
I avoided debris in the road, officer. I stayed in control.
Is there anything illegal in the vehicle tonight?
No, sir. Are we being detained or are we free to go?
The flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror did not just signal a routine traffic stop. They marked the beginning of a 45-minute constitutional violation that would eventually dismantle a police department's reputation and cost the city millions. It was 1:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. The kind of dead hour where the world feels completely hollowed out, save for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional flicker of a failing street lamp. The air inside the 10-year-old Honda Accord was thick with the lingering scent of stale diner coffee and exhaustion. At the wheel was Julian, an architect in his late 30s who lived his life by precise measurements and predictable structural loads, his hands usually steady when drafting blueprints, now gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Marcus, a structural engineer and Julian's business partner. They had spent the last 5 hours at a 24-hour diner 3 miles back down the highway, surrounded by the clatter of silverware and the low hum of fluorescent lights, desperately trying to finalize a bid for a municipal library project due the next morning. They were tired, their eyes gritty from staring at glowing laptop screens, their minds entirely consumed by concrete stress tests and zoning regulations. The stretch of State Route 114 they were traveling was notoriously dim, flanked on one side by an abandoned industrial park and on the other by a dense line of unkempt pine trees. Julian had swerved just slightly, an inch or two over the faded yellow line, to avoid a massive piece of blown-out tire tread resting in the middle of the dark lane. It was a reflexive, defensive maneuver, the kind of minor correction any driver would make to protect their vehicle's undercarriage. Less than 30 seconds later, the darkness behind them exploded into a blinding strobe light display of emergency red and blues. Julian let out a heavy, slow exhale, his heart giving a sudden, uncomfortable lurch against his ribs. He checked his mirrors, the intense glare washing out his vision, and activated his right turn signal. He guided the Accord onto the narrow, gravel-strewn shoulder, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window. The sudden rush of freezing November air biting at his face. Marcus sat up straighter, rubbing a hand over his tired face, the sudden adrenaline cutting through his fatigue. They exchanged a brief, uneasy glance. Neither of them had a criminal record. Neither of them had been drinking. They were just two professionals heading home after a grueling night of work. But the atmosphere in the car was instantly suffocating. Through the side mirror, Julian watched the silhouette of a police cruiser sitting an aggressively short distance behind his bumper. The blinding spotlight attached to the cruiser's A-pillar snapped on, flooding the Accord's cabin with an interrogative, blinding white light. It was an intentional tactic designed to disorient and establish immediate authority. Julian squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of the Accord's cooling engine and the low, staticky squawk of the police radio echoing from the cruiser. This delayed approach was a psychological tool, letting the occupants of the stopped vehicle stew in their own mounting anxiety. Finally, the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut shattered the quiet. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, the heavy crunch of boots on loose gravel sounding unnaturally loud. Julian kept his hands draped visibly over the top of the steering wheel, a survival mechanism ingrained in him from years of understanding how quickly a misunderstanding in the dark could turn fatal. Two officers approached the vehicle. One hung back near the rear quarter panel on the passenger side, a shadowy figure resting a hand near his utility belt, observing Marcus. The primary officer stepped up to Julian's window. He was young, perhaps late 20s, with a tightly clipped haircut and a posture that radiated an artificial practice hardness. His nameplate caught the ambient light reading Officer Vance. He did not offer a greeting. He did not introduce himself. He leaned down slightly, a flashlight gripped in his left hand, the beam sweeping aggressively across the dashboard, illuminating the back seat, lingering on the two large leather briefcases resting on the floorboards, and finally snapping directly into Julian's eyes. Julian blinked hard, turning his head slightly away from the blinding beam. The officer's voice was flat, devoid of any conversational warmth, carrying a sharp edge of command. He demanded to know where they were coming from and where they were going in such a hurry. Julian kept his voice carefully level, fighting the sudden, irrational tremor in his chest. He explained politely that they were not in a hurry at all, that they had just left the Silver Diner down the road and were heading back to his house in the next town over to finalize a work project. He explained that they were architects and engineers. Officer Vance's expression did not change. He seemed completely uninterested in the explanation, dismissing the reality of their situation because it did not fit the narrative he had already begun constructing in his mind. He asked for Julian's license, registration, and proof of insurance. As Julian slowly moved his hand toward the glove compartment, narrating his actions aloud to ensure there were no sudden movements, Vance's flashlight beam tracked his every millimeter of motion. Marcus, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, cleared his throat and asked, with genuine, mild curiosity, what the reason for the stop was. Vance shifted his gaze to Marcus. The flashlight beam hitting Marcus directly in the face, Vance stated coldly that the vehicle had failed to maintain its lane, crossing the center line, which constituted careless driving. Julian opened his mouth to mention the massive piece of tire debris in the road, but immediately closed it. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that arguing the initial point of the stop on the side of a dark highway was a losing battle. He handed over the requested documents. Vance snatched them from Julian's outstretched hand, told them to sit tight, and walked backward for 3 steps before turning toward his cruiser. Sitting in the freezing car, the adrenaline began to sour into a quiet, simmering indignity. Marcus leaned his head back against the headrest, staring at the roof of the car, muttering under his breath about how ridiculous the situation was. Julian just watched the rearview mirror. He could see the silhouettes of Vance and his partner, Sergeant Kincaid, illuminated by the glow of the cruiser's laptop screen. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The legal threshold for a routine traffic stop is the time it reasonably takes to run the driver's information, check for outstanding warrants, and write a citation. By the 20-minute mark, the boundaries of the Fourth Amendment were quietly, but definitively, being fractured. Inside the cruiser, Vance was staring at a completely clean background check. Julian had no warrants, a pristine driving record, and the vehicle was properly registered and insured. The purpose of the stop had been legally fulfilled. They should have been issued a warning or a ticket for the lane deviation and sent on their way. But Sergeant Kincaid, a 15-year veteran of the force, had a different philosophy. He operated on a localized, unchecked internal bias that dictated that 2 men driving down an industrial stretch of road at 1 a.m, carrying large leather bags, who looked slightly nervous when pulled over, were inherently suspicious. They vaguely matched an incredibly broad description of a suspicious vehicle called in by a neighborhood watch member 3 miles away 2 days ago, a dark sedan. It was an impossibly thin thread of logic, entirely devoid of actual probable cause or reasonable articulable suspicion. Kincaid instructed Vance to hold on to the licenses and go back up to the car to press them for consent to search the vehicle. This specific decision was the fatal procedural error under the precedent set by the Supreme Court in Rodriguez v. United States. A police officer may not extend an otherwise completed traffic stop absent reasonable suspicion. in order to conduct unrelated investigative checks. By holding onto their identification after the background check was clear, the officers transformed a routine traffic stop into an unconstitutional detention. Julian watched in the mirror as Vance emerged from the cruiser again. The walk was different this time, slower, more predatory. When Vance reached the window, he did not hand back the documents. Instead, he rested his forearm on the roof of the Accord, leaning in close, invading the physical space of the vehicle. He asked Julian, again, where they had been. Julian repeated his answer, his voice tighter this time, the frustration beginning to leak through his practiced calm. Vance then asked if there were any weapons, large amounts of currency, or illegal narcotics in the vehicle. The question hung in the freezing air, absurd and deeply offensive. Marcus let out a sharp, incredulous breath. Julian stared directly at the officer, stating firmly that there was absolutely nothing illegal in the car, that they were professionals coming from a diner, and he asked directly and clearly if they were free to go. Vance ignored the question. He stated that the area had seen a recent spike in commercial burglaries and that their presence on this specific road at this specific time was highly suspicious. He asked Julian for consent to search the vehicle. Julian, knowing his rights and feeling the weight of the injustice settling heavily over him, politely but firmly declined. He stated that he did not consent to any searches of his property. The atmosphere instantly shifted from tense to hostile. Vance's posture stiffened. He informed Julian that he was going to call for a K9 unit to conduct an open-air sniff of the vehicle's exterior, and until the dog arrived, they were not permitted to leave. He ordered Julian to turn off the car completely and hand over the keys. For the next 25 minutes, Julian and Marcus sat in a freezing, dead silent car, their breath pluming in the cold air. They were held hostage by the badge, stripped of their liberty on the side of a desolate highway simply because they refused to surrender their Fourth Amendment rights to satisfy an officer's unfounded hunch. The humiliation was profound. They watched as cars occasionally sped past, the driver slowing down slightly to gawk at the police lights, undoubtedly assuming the two men sitting in the dark sedan were criminals. When the K9 unit finally arrived, another 10 minutes later, the dog circled the car twice, sniffing intently at the door seams and the trunk. It found nothing. It signaled nothing, because there was nothing to find, defeated, and legally out of options to hold them any longer without risking an immediate lawsuit. Kincaid finally walked up to the window. He practically threw the licenses back into Julian's lap, his jaw tight with frustration, and issued a verbal warning for the lane deviation. He told them to drive safely, an ironic command considering the psychological trauma they had just inflicted, and walked away. The drive back to Julian's house was entirely silent. The quiet was no longer born of fatigue, but of a deep, vibrating anger and a profound sense of violation. They had been treated like suspects, detained against their will, intimidated, and delayed for nearly an hour, all based on a profound misapplication of police authority and unchecked bias. But Julian was not just angry, he was meticulous. He was an architect who understood how to document structural failures, and he recognized that he had just survived a severe structural failure of the justice system. What the officers did not know, what they had failed to notice in their aggressive posturing, was that Julian had recently installed a high-definition, dual-facing dash camera tucked discreetly behind his rearview mirror. The camera not only recorded high-resolution video of the dark road and the blinding lights, but it was also equipped with an incredibly sensitive microphone that had captured every single word spoken through the driver's side window. The next morning, Julian did not go to work. Instead, he and Marcus walked into the office of a prominent civil rights attorney in the city. They handed over the memory card from the dash camera. The attorney listened to the audio, tracked the timestamps, and immediately recognized the blatant violation of the Rodriguez precedent. A formal complaint was filed, followed swiftly by a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Vance Sergeant Kincaid. The police department and the city alleging unlawful detention, violation of the Fourth Amendment, and a pattern of systemic bias in pretextual traffic stops. The lawsuit landed on the desk of Police Chief Thomas Sterling. Sterling was a man who had built his entire career in a different era of law enforcement. A time when trusting a cop's gut instinct was praised rather than scrutinized. He was a staunch defender of proactive policing, believing firmly that aggressive traffic enforcement was the key to catching real criminals. When he first read the complaint, his internal bias immediately flared to protect his officers. He viewed Julian and Marcus not as victims of a constitutional violation, but as uncooperative citizens who had made things difficult for officers working a dangerous night shift. During his initial press briefing regarding the impending lawsuit, Chief Sterling's tone was dismissive. He subtly framed the narrative to suggest that if the men had simply consented to the search, the situation would have been resolved much faster. He defended the officers' actions as standard investigative procedure, completely ignoring the legal boundaries of a completed traffic stop. However, the legal process is a slow, grinding machine that relies on evidence, not instinct. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, the plaintiff's attorney subpoenaed the dashcam footage from Officer Vance's cruiser, as well as the audio recordings from the officers' body cameras. While Vance and Kincaid had been careful with their words while standing at Julian's window, they had been remarkably careless while sitting inside the insulated cabin of their own cruiser. The audio from Vance's body camera, which he had forgotten to mute while running the entirely clean background check, captured a conversation that would doom the city's defense over the staticky hum of the cruiser's heater. Sergeant Kincaid could be heard clearly stating that the background check was clean, but that they should hold on to the IDs anyway. He specifically said, "They look too clean for this time of night. Press them for a search. If they say no, hold them for the dog. We'll find something to justify it later." That single recorded sentence was the turning point. It was not a dramatic courtroom confession. It was a quiet, careless admission of a conspiracy to violate constitutional rights captured on digital storage. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the extension of the traffic stop was not based on any reasonable suspicion of a crime, but on a deliberate, malicious intent to manufacture a reason to search the vehicle simply because the officers felt like it laid bare the subtle, insidious bias that equated being on a certain road late at night with inherent criminality. When the case finally went before a federal judge for summary judgment, the ruling was devastating for the city. The judge issued a scathingly worded 40-page decision, systematically tearing apart the police department's defense. The judge meticulously detailed the timeline of the stop, pointing out the exact minute the legal justification for the detention expired, and the exact moment it transformed into an illegal seizure under the Fourth Amendment. The ruling emphasized that the constitutional rights of citizens do not evaporate simply because it is late at night, nor do they diminish simply because an officer possesses an unfounded hunch. The judge ruled that Officer Vance and Sergeant Kincaid were not entitled to qualified immunity because their actions violated clearly established law that any reasonable officer should have known. The consequences were far from instantaneous, but they were deeply realistic and profoundly damaging. The city, facing a guaranteed loss at a jury trial and a massive payout, was forced into a multi-million-dollar settlement. But the financial cost was only a fraction of the fallout. The judge's ruling triggered an automatic review by the Department of Justice into the city's policing practices. Sergeant Kincaid, facing internal affairs investigations and stripped of his police powers, chose to take an early disgrace retirement rather than face termination. Officer Vance was suspended without pay and permanently transferred to desk duty. His credibility as an arresting officer completely shattered. No prosecutor would ever put him on a witness stand again. Chief Sterling found himself standing in front of a bank of news cameras months later. his demeanor vastly different from his initial dismissive arrogance. The public scrutiny was intense. The community outraged by the undeniable proof of systemic overreach. Under immense political pressure from the mayor's office, Sterling was forced to publicly apologize to Julian and Marcus, an apology that tasted like ash in his mouth. He was forced to implement sweeping policy changes regarding pretextual stops, mandate extensive constitutional law, retraining for his entire department, and establish a civilian oversight board. The culture of trusting the gut had been forcibly replaced by the rigorous demands of the law. The dim stretch of Route 114 remains the same today, cold and quiet in the early hours of the morning. But the power dynamic that exists in the flashing lights of a police cruiser has been permanently altered in that jurisdiction. The story of that night forces a quiet, uncomfortable reckoning with the immense authority granted to those who wear a badge, and how easily that authority can slip into tyranny when unchecked by the rigid boundaries of the Constitution. When the system relies on the assumption of guilt rather than the presumption of innocence, who is actually being protected and who is merely being targeted? The line between safety and subjugation is not drawn by instinct, but by the law. And when that line is crossed in the dark, the resulting light exposes the deepest flaws in the foundation of justice,